From the Western Mass News studios in Springfield, this is Western Mass News Getting Answers with Dave Mattson.
Thanks for taking some time to be with me for this week's edition of Western Mass News Getting Answers. Every week, I'm joined by political and business leaders and other newsmakers to talk about the issues that impact you. This week, I'm joined by Northwestern District Attorney David Sullivan. David Sullivan was elected Northwestern DA in 2010. He is the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for Hampshire and Franklin counties in the town of Athol. He started his law career in 1987 as a civilian trial attorney representing the Army and Air Force service members in general and special court martials in West Germany. He was the East Hampton City Attorney from 1999 to 2002 when he was elected Register of Probate for Hampshire Probate and Family Court. He served as Registrar from January of 2003 to January 2011. And time permitting, we will focus on a fourth trial for Cara Rintala in her wife's 2010 murder, the battle against opioid addiction, and as well as the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the trials in the Northwestern District. David, good to see you.
Great to see you.
Thanks for being here. Let's talk about the Cara Rintala trial. The state's top court overturning the guilty verdict against Rintala in her wife's 2010 murder, ordering a new trial in Hampshire Superior Court. So as we look at this, the first two trials ended in hung juries. The third trial, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You're looking at a fourth trial for her.
Yes. And it's a case that, unfortunately, the two juries we had couldn't come up with a unanimous verdict, which, as everybody knows, you need to have everybody in agreement. And so we moved to a third trial, and very tough for the family, seeing some justice in the third trial with a guilty verdict, but it was overturned by the Supreme Court. They ruled that the expert in the case really shouldn't have testified to the extent that he did.
Now, this is unusual, a fourth trial in any kind of case.
Very unusual, yeah. And so we've got a strong case, and we'll be moving forward. I wouldn't imagine it's going to be tried probably for another year, because there's new trial counsel that are assigned to the case, and they'll have to do their due diligence and work on the case, and we're ready to go whenever it gets set.
Process is never a quick one, is it?
No, it's not. And it's particularly in a homicide case, as a former defense attorney, sure. I understand, hey, you need to make sure that, all your ducks are in order and you're ready to go. But we'll hopefully see a just verdict down the road.
Let's talk about, you co-founded Hampshire Hope, Heroin Opioid Prevention and Education Coalition, as well as the Opioid Task Force of Franklin County and the North Quabbin region. Is any progress being made in fighting opioid addiction?
There's been a tremendous amount of progress in Hampshire and Franklin County due to the fact that when this crisis hit, there wasn't a single residential bed in our 47 communities, and now we have well over 100. There's more outpatient care, and the distribution of Narcan to prevent overdose fatalities has really been tremendous. Balanced with, now we have fentanyl. Is so much different than heroin. It's so much stronger, 25 to 50 times stronger than your heroin, and that has really taken over the trade. So really fentanyl is probably in 90 to 95% of all our opioid fatalities now. So it's changed dramatically, and this has just been in the last 3 years.
It's that potent.
It's that potent.
Let's talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the opioid problem. Has it made it tougher?
Yeah, I think that COVID has resulted in more isolation, more people being disconnected, and that really exacerbates the whole addiction. So I think that we really have had those numbers, and last year was the highest numbers we've ever had in our district. We had communities that suffered probably 3 times the amount of addiction, related deaths.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that, okay, the opioid problem, it's more of a big city thing, but it really isn't. There's no family or no community that's been untouched by this.
No, it's been a ripple effect, really a tidal wave, and particularly for these rural communities. We have rates of 90 per 100,000 deaths in 5 of our communities, and that's 3 times the rate. It's 30 per 100,000 is the opioid death rate around the state, and these communities 90, 95, 100 per 100,000. So that's a real big hit, in our Quabbin communities, Athol and Ware are experiencing really tough situations with the opioid addiction and deaths.
Your office has been dealing with COVID-19 like everyone else for the last 2 years. What impact has COVID had as far as cases that you're prosecuting? Is it put you behind, or are you pretty much?
Well, we never closed down.
Yeah.
I say us and Dunkin' Donuts never closed down, as well as the police departments. But we've really been working on those cases. We've really wanted to resolve them. Usually about 90 to 95% of cases settle anyhow, prior to trial. So we've really tried to work collaboratively with the defense bar and with the judiciary. And so the backlog now is really about jury trials, because we've been very careful to make sure that juries aren't exposed to COVID. But we've had big courtrooms that have accommodated some of our trials, and hopefully the trial court will go back to where they'll be bringing juries back in. So when that happens, we'll be ready to go.
Well, at least you aren't like the Hampden County Courthouse in Hampshire or Franklin, where you've had to deal with these mold issues either.
Oh, it's
also played a factor.
Terrible situation in Hampden County. The justice system has really been paralyzed because there are those health issues of great concern to everybody, from employees to jurors. So hopefully, we'll move forward. But I really feel so bad for the people that work in that courthouse.
Yeah. I mean, back to the opioid issue. We've long heard that the I-91 corridor had the nickname of the heroin highway. Does it still have that reputation?
It really does. I mean, it runs drugs. Basically, the drugs start in Mexico, obviously, but it goes to New York City, and it comes up 95 to 91, and you're really starting in Hartford and Springfield, Holyoke, and all the way up to Vermont. And I think that it's a nickname, but I think it's well deserved. I have to say it's probably the fentanyl freeway now, because probably about 90 to 95% of all the opioids that are being distributed now are fentanyl.
That's just frightening. I mean, I think we all know someone or some family who's been impacted by this situation with opioids. It's like I mentioned, nobody's unscathed.
It's tragic. It really is. And when I think about, looking back to when I started as DA, this wasn't even an issue. No. I mean, there were maybe, I'd say 6 to 10 people a year that would be impacted by opioid deaths. And last year alone, we had almost 70. So it just shows you the 7-fold increase.
That's staggering. And you had touched on this, mentioning about housing, a vital part of the mission of people who are recovering from addiction. Released from jail, they experience housing insecurity and more likely to wind up back in the criminal justice system. Let's talk about the importance of housing and having a place for them.
Yeah. We're very fortunate in the Valley. We have 3 of the best sheriffs in Massachusetts, bar none. Sheriff Donlin up in Franklin County, Sheriff Kaling in Hampshire, and Sheriff Kochi in Hampden, and they really work hard on trying to place people with that housing so they have stability. And without stability, how can you expect somebody to address their addiction issues and stay in recovery? So I know that that's one of their missions. One of my missions is I don't want to see people get back into the system. So they work hard, and we're very supportive of that. And unfortunately, the housing crisis for everybody is there. And we just see that housing crisis. Rents are very expensive, and it's that affordability that really is really the crisis. It's affordable housing. There's always housing for people that have the money, but for those that are on a very limited income, it's very difficult to find good places.
And it sounds too that if you aren't in a controlled situation where people are keeping an eye on you day after day, and if you're on your own, it's probably just going to fuel the problem even more.
It is. When people are released, they're unsupervised. Maybe they'll have a probation or a parole officer, but for the most part, hey, they're on their own. And it's that housing, it's having a stable work situation. And again, some folks just have burned bridges and don't always have family to support them.
I think the other thing with that, and from what I've heard and from what I've seen, that with whether fentanyl addiction or heroin addiction, it turns these people into different people. I mean, that's the frightening thing, I think.
Yeah, and I always explain to families that have had this situation, it's not the person that you know.
Yeah.
It's a whole different person. Their addiction has really changed them, and they'll come back, but stick with them. And it's very hard, though. I mean, they've really turned that corner in the wrong way, and hope that with good recovery and a stable environment, that they'll be back to where they were.
What's the main source of addiction? I mean, the number of cases, I mean, you hear that, well, these begin with prescribed medications, painkillers or whatever else, like Oxycontin, and when they can't get a hold of that anymore, this is what they turn to.
Well, back about 5 years ago, they did a study, and they said about 75 to 80% of all the people getting addicted to heroin, it was because of the pills.
Yeah.
And how that has changed, I don't really see that changing that much. Now, unfortunately, instead of them getting an Oxycodone, they're getting a fentanyl pill, disguised as. So that's where some of these overdoses have really come in, because they think that they're getting an Oxycodone, which, it's a legal one, but at least you don't have a mix of all sorts of stuff.
Right.
So that's something that's really tough. So I think that we've gotten a better handle with physicians, making sure they monitor the distribution. And I understand people. These are lifesavers for people because they're in chronic pain and they need something to get through that day. But it was that entire fraudulent marketing that said, hey, these things aren't addictive. You can take as many as you want and you're going to be all set. You're not going to get addicted. And we found out through all the lawsuits and all the litigation that this was absolutely false, that this was misleading to a lot of physicians and to their patients.
Indeed. All right, we're going to take a break. Yeah. And when we come back, we're going to talk about dealing with domestic violence and cyber stalking. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers. My guest this week is Northwestern District Attorney David Sullivan. You are the Domestic Violence Unit. Let's talk about that. Hosting a webinar not long ago sharing the methods used by cyber stalkers and to offer tips on how to stay safe. How big of an issue is cyber stalking?
Oh, it's a tremendous issue because everybody's got the internet through their iPhone and whatever. And so being able to follow people online, to be able to stalk them, to be able to intimidate them online is just something that happens. And you'd think that, hey, maybe it's just for teenagers. No, it goes into the adult world as well, that probably at least 50% of the folks that have experienced domestic violence experience that stalking through the cyber world.
Are you finding it's easier to track now than it was, say, when you took office in 10, 12 years ago?
It's just exploded. Some of the stuff you just can't track. They have all these bots, and they can figure out ways to do it anonymously, and it's just almost too much to keep up with.
Always one step ahead.
Yep, exactly.
So you try to get that upper hand on them.
Yeah, criminals are pretty resourceful. They use all the tools that they need. So, but fortunately, we got some very good investigators that understand that world and can investigate it.
That's, when you talk about, we had DA Gallooni on talking about the investigators in your office. I mean, they're really the heart and soul of your office and what they do, aren't they?
In our rural communities, we have probably 8 police departments that have detectives, so there's another 39 departments that don't. So they really rely on our Mass State Police investigators. They do a lot of the felony investigations for these small towns, and in addition to the detectives we have in our communities, they're really tremendous and very dedicated to public safety.
And one of the things we were talking about actually off air was because you've got such a huge territory to cover, that working with these police departments, these small town police departments, that you've got a good working relationship with all of them. That's key to everything.
Oh yeah, we have tremendous local law enforcement agencies, and we work hand in hand. We work with them on trainings, we work with them on investigations. We just want to make sure everybody succeeds, and the better the investigation, the better the case that we can present to a jury.
Sure. You're backing a law that would criminalize the harmful distribution of sexually explicit materials in Massachusetts and provide a formal avenue to divert sexting cases involving underage people outside of the criminal system. In less than a decade, nearly every state has outlawed revenge porn. So why is it taking so long in Massachusetts, do you think?
Things move slow in the Massachusetts legislature. There's a lot of reasons.
The State House has been closed for 2 years too, right?
There's about 7,000 to 8,000 bills that are filed a year. So it's sometimes hard to percolate up to the top, but I think the time has come to make sure there's accountability, because it's usually because of an intimate relationship that these photographs or this media is produced. And when the relationship goes south, which it does sometimes,
Sure.
as people know, you just don't want this type of images disseminated on the internet. And it's really emotionally devastating for the victims of these crimes. So it's just bringing us into the 21st century. So I think it's a very healthy approach. The bill is both about what we call revenge porn, but these images, but it's also for teens with sexting, and that happens all too often in high schools, junior highs, and we want to make sure that is a teaching moment, that they can get education, they can get the right counseling, particularly if they're a victim, and because the victim is also the distributor. So it's kind of both they're the offender and they're the victim, to make sure that happens instead of going the criminal process route.
So a big part of what you're doing too is getting help for these people.
Exactly. Yeah.
I know you and Franklin County Sheriff Chris Donald have joined the national initiative to promote innovative practices in non-urban communities amid the national conversation around criminal justice reform. What are you hoping to accomplish with that?
There's probably 2,000 prosecutors that represent the different counties around America. And most of them are rural. Most of them are suburban. They aren't the big cities that we see. And so much of the resources have been toward these programs that are for the big cities that have lots of money, quite frankly, to do these things. And this is to make sure we scale it down. We come up with workable programs and templates for other prosecutors' offices to adopt. Our domestic violence program has been really the cutting edge around the country, and we want to make sure we share that with other small prosecutors' offices so that they can adopt it. And then other programs, for example, Sheriff Donald has an incredible program for helping people with addiction. And so he's on that as well, so that he can share his both successes and any failures, because we want to make sure that people know that, hey, you have to try these things sometimes, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but you have to scale them the right way.
Sure. Yeah, you're touching on domestic violence again. It's an ongoing problem, and probably in the smaller communities, more so than anybody would even think. And again, as we go back to COVID, the added stress on these families and everything else. Have you seen an uptick in domestic violence?
Absolutely, and more serious. By the time people decide to report to police, it's actually a very serious case. So we saw the cases kind of go down knowing that, but the more serious ones percolated to the top. Suffocation, strangulation, those very serious physical assaults were really percolating to the top.
Yeah. Northampton has established the Department of Community Care to overlook, say, mental health, substance abuse, and similar cases from police. And I was talking to Commissioner Clapprood in Springfield about this. What's your thoughts on that?
I'm very happy with our police departments because probably starting about 10 years ago, they started crisis intervention teams and de-escalation. And so most of our departments got trained by the Department of Public Health on crisis intervention teams to formulate them. And that was all the way from the chief to the newest patrol officer. So this is a next step, which is really encouraging because police don't want to have to go out to every call, but they probably will, and then maybe hand it off to that social worker or whatever. But to me, it's a supplement to police. It's not about defunding the police, it's about supplementing and helping the police. And if we have the right trained people that will do that, and that's happening in, I think, about 8 communities now in Hampshire and Franklin County. They're collaborative, they work with other towns because sometimes there just isn't enough work in one town, but by combining 2 or 3, it really makes sense. And East Hampton and Hadley have been joined together, and other communities up in Franklin County. So I'm really encouraged by it. I think anytime that you can de-escalate and make sure that these people don't fall into the criminal justice system, to make sure they get the mental health help that they need.
I know when I was talking with Commissioner Clapprood, we were talking that in Springfield alone in 2021, they responded to 2,000 mental health cases. So it's more prevalent than a lot of people think.
Right, and it's one of those things where I think the police officer and a social worker need to go out together, and then maybe that warm handoff. But you don't want somebody going out there. Anything can happen on a call. Things can escalate awfully quick, and you just have to make sure that the assessment is done in a safe way.
All right. We're going to take another break. When we come back, DA Sullivan and I talk about an initiative that would bring a model of restorative justice to the area that seeks to divert some adults out of the criminal justice system. Stay with us. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers. I'm pleased to be joined this week by Northwestern District Attorney David Sullivan. Back in October, your office, as well as 6 Hampshire County Police Departments, announcing that you're going to be working alongside a nonprofit to bring a model of restorative justice to the area that seeks to divert some adults out of the criminal justice system. What's that all about?
Well, restorative justice is a process that actually goes back to the indigenous people over 2,000 years ago. And it's a way to take that harm doer, the offender, and work with the community and with the victim, if the victim wants it, to make sure that things get back together, that harm is addressed, but that both parties can move on. And so our 6 police departments in Hampshire County have worked with Communities for Justice, and that's a group out of Eastern Mass that we've affiliated with, and cases actually get referred by the police departments even before they get to court, which is very important, versus the criminal process. Let's go through the restorative justice process. And our office refers cases actually post, if they are in the criminal justice system and it seems appropriate, we'll make those referrals as well. So we actually had a restorative justice program in Franklin County for over 20 years. That was a nonprofit. Yeah. One of the first in the country. It was a tremendous one. It lost its funding through the trial court, but again, we saw the results and how important it was. For example, there was a community that experienced grave tipping. As people know, when graves get knocked over, it's a very traumatic thing for the families. And they had 12 offenders, juveniles, and they were able to bring them together, and the whole community accepted their apology, and then they were able to move on. So it's a really transformative process for people to go through. So I'm encouraged by all our police departments and how willing they were to get involved with it.
Sure. Now, I know you've urged state lawmakers to strengthen penalties for drivers that take police on high-speed chases. You've spoken in favor of House Bill 3420, an act relative to dangerous high-speed pursuits, strengthening the penalties. That's key, isn't it?
There was a real gap there. People, it's not about somebody who doesn't stop right away, even driving a half a mile at a moderate speed. It's about the offenders that drive 100, 120 miles an hour along 91 or through towns. I saw somebody driving through Northampton at 75 miles an hour, and those are the ones we want to address, those ones that are reckless, and that's an element of it, that fail to stop. And they endanger not only the motorists, but pedestrians in towns as these people go through. So we're hoping to take that gap and addressing that, hopefully will get taken care of.
You're also one of a number of district attorneys in the state who've stopped using evidence from breathalyzer tests in drunk driving cases because of growing concerns about that. Is it working better that way, do you think?
Well, we'd love to use the breathalyzer because it's very good, but we don't have the reliability. And the judge that's been assigned the case says, hey, we can start using them again, but maybe we won't. So we just don't want to prosecute anybody unless it's 100% reliable. And until the judge determines that these tests are reliable, then we're just going to back off, and we'll have to use the evidence that's to the field officer. Their erratic driving, their inability to put words together to show impairment. So I just feel more comfortable. Hey, we may not win in as many cases, but the main thing is that we can do justice in the right way.
All right. David Sullivan, we're out of time.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to join me this week. Let's do this again.
Sure.
Thank you at home for watching, too. I'm Dave Mattson. Stay safe, stay well. If you can, join us next week for Western Mass News Getting Answers.